You're on.
You're on.
Okay. First of all, I'm looking at Brandon, and to think that I look like that almost 60 years ago is scary. Believe me. Anyway, I was invited by Brandon to come before you and kind of relate my personal experiences that I had during World War II. If you'll notice, I had to put some of the stuff down on 3x5 cards because, as some of you may know, the second thing to go is your mind. I won't tell you what the first thing is. I'll let you think of it yourself. Anyway, I graduated high school in 1943, and immediately upon graduation, I enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Force, and I was sent to Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania for Air Force training. I wasn't up there but 30 days, and I found myself, along with some others, transferred to the infantry. At that time, the Air Force was part of the Army, and I guess they had enough flyboys, but anybody who volunteered to go into the infantry had to be off their rocker. So this is the way they got people who enlisted, unless you were drafted from some small town out in the Midwest or down south. But anyway, I spent about 60 days up at Lehigh University, and then I was assigned to Fort Blanding, Florida, to take basic training. And went into the Okefenokee Swamp. I was trained in jungle warfare, but I was sent to Europe. Typical Army, right? Anyway, after 13 weeks of basic training, I was assigned to the 66th Infantry Division in Camp Rucker, Alabama. And from there, we went through maneuvers, and we sent to, forget Pine Hill somewhere in New Jersey, and we boarded convoy ships to Europe. And I was one of those that went on to USS George Washington, which was a converted World War I German luxury ship. I think it was the fastest ship in the convoy, did 18 knots an hour. Took us 11 days to get to Southampton, England. And 11 days, I was about ready to commit suicide. Even now, if I get into the bathtub, I get seasick. Anyway, we went into, from Southampton, they took us to a little town in Dorchester, and were British Army barracks, and we went through maneuvers. And then the Battle of the Bulge had started. The Germans, as I understand it, were going to make their push to try to get to Paris by Christmas. And on Christmas Eve in 1944, we went down to Southampton, and there were two troop ships. I forget the name of the other one, but one was the SS Leopoldville, which was a Belgian ship that escaped from Belgium during the occupation of Germany, went to Africa, North Africa, and it served as a troop ship for Americans. It was operated by the British Transportation Corps. They had a Belgian Congo crew, which is now Zaire, and Indonesian cooks. I wouldn't eat the food they were serving on there anyway. It was like 24 hours across the channel. But anyway, we got 5 miles off the coast of Cherbourg, and a German U-boat came up and sent a torpedo right through the ship. 5 miles off the coast of Cherbourg. And for some reason or other, there was, being Christmas Eve, the personnel at Cherbourg were celebrating a Christmas party, and again, there was a snafu. Rather than notifying back in Dover to send out rescue ships, they called in Cherbourg. And these guys were half under the weather anyway there. They didn't want to drop anchor for fear of hitting any mines. So as a result, it was like 3 hours before anybody notified GIs what to do. As a result, the last that I remember was there's the shutter the SS Leopoldville. The remaining lifeboats, whatever I had, were lowered by the Belgian crew. They took off the shore. The British transportation crew that was operating the ship never gave the order to abandon the ship. And secondly, or rather thirdly, what happened was that when we boarded the troop ship, instead of keeping the units together as they usually do, everybody was in disarray. Who was one outfit? I was in I Company, 264th Regiment. This was one part of the ship, was the other. I was having one of the fortunate ones that I was above the waterline. And when the torpedo hit, just you could hear a shuddering. And we started to come up on deck. And rifles, arms are left below deck. We were on hammocks. It took 24 hours to cross the English Channel. And there's a picture of the ship. This was done by Norman Rockwell's son. Now this is kind of a misnomer, because as I remember, as they got on board the ship, none of them carried their rifles. I know I didn't, a lot of them didn't, and didn't have their overcoats. And as a result, after 3 hours, the ship started to sink. In the meantime, they sent out British destroyers and frigates, ocean-going tugs. And as the ship was going down, I'm not a sailor, but it was like from the stern. Incidentally, there's a monument. Those was 700, I believe, was 733 or 933 that lost their lives. 763, I'm sorry. This pointed out was one of the greatest single incident loss of life in the history of World War II. And as a result, I remember being on the stern part of the ship, and I was to say below the waterline when the torpedo hit, there were those that were trapped, couldn't get out. Those who were trying to get off, as these British destroyers came, the English Channel, I don't know if any of you have ever been there or crossed it. It's pretty rough that time of the year especially. And they were crushed between the ships. I was one of the fortunate ones who went down. I got picked up on Christmas Day by an English-going tug. And I was put into a field hospital in France, in Cherbourg, which I remained there for 3 weeks to a month. And when I got out, the outfit that I was with had gone up into Brest in the northern France. And I was assigned to the 42nd Rainbow Division in Austria. And before I get into the next phase, I believe Brandon has the History Channel, who many of you may watch, did a segment on the sinking of the Leopoldville. And I think that Brandon might want to show this at this time rather.
Race it or turn away.
Lennon was shot to death late last night outside his apartment building.
But
in December 1944, the men of the U.S. Army's 66th Infantry Division were stationed in these barracks at Piddlehinton, Dorset, in the rolling English countryside. Newly arrived from the United States, they were homesick and nervous. Suddenly, orders came to ship out. This would be their first time in combat. Reinforcements were needed for the Battle of the Bulge, raging in Belgium, the veteran German Army's blitzkrieg in a last-ditch effort to win the war. At Southampton, they came to this dock in the middle of the night. A terrible tragedy lay ahead. In the second biggest American sea disaster of World War II, over 800 of these young men, mostly 18 to 20-year-olds, would not make it to the French coast alive. Officially, they are still missing in action. But they are not missing. They never have been. They are here, entombed 200 feet under the sea. where they died together in a disaster so horrible and unnecessary that it was hidden from the families of the dead men and the American public for 50 years. The 534-foot Belgian ocean liner, SS Leopoldville, was built in 1929. During the 1930s, it was put into service as a luxury passenger ship on the profitable route between Antwerp and the Belgian colony of the Congo. Her passengers were served by a large crew of 237, and its rich interiors, copied from a Belgian chateau, made the ship very popular among its mainly wealthy clientele. During the summer months, the liner was used as a cruise ship, sailing to ports of call all over the Mediterranean and Baltic seas. Belgian Captain Charles Limbour was put in command of the ship at the outbreak of the war. The British Admiralty converted the luxury liner into a troop ship by removing its rich appointments, adding guns, and transforming the cargo holds into sleeping quarters. With its Belgian crew and British gunners, the Leopoldville spent the next 5 years on convoy duty, running the gauntlet of German Luftwaffe and U-boats. In December 1944, as the end of the war appeared near, Captain Limbour and his crew looked forward to finally returning home to liberated Belgium. But then, suddenly,
The Christmas season of 1944, nobody was predicting that the war would end by Saturday night. The Army had come fast and far last fall. We had developed a certain tendency to become complacent. In December, we learned all over again the bitter lesson of war. We lost men, 78,000 in dead, wounded, and missing.
Now equipped with snorkels, the German U-boats were ordered into the English Channel for the first time. Their mission was to cut the Allied supply lines from England to the American Army in Belgium. The new snorkels enabled the submarines to stay submerged for long periods of time and operate in shallow waters with a lower risk of detection. Their main target was Cherbourg, the only operational port in Allied hands in Northern Europe. On December 23rd, U-486, commanded by Gerhard Meyer, opened fire just 7 miles off the French coast and sunk the 6,000-ton British ship Silver Laurel. The next day, Christmas Eve, the Leopoldville was ordered to Southampton to transport soldiers to General Eisenhower's embattled army in Belgium. The loading operation started off badly. In the confusion and haste at dockside, another Army unit had been loaded on the ship, instead of the 66th. These men had to be taken off. Reloading would begin at 2:30 a.m. and last all night.
Boarded the Leopoldville in Southampton and was immediately sent up to the bow of the ship in a mess hall, looked like a mess hall with bunks in it.
Units were mixed. In the morning, the passenger list was found to be incomplete. The British port authorities decided it was too late to correct the error and ordered the ship to sail on the morning tide, grossly overloaded with 2,235 soldiers.
It was supposed to be a fast crossing as far as I know. The sailing date had been changed as far as I understand. We were supposed to sail on Christmas Day, but they'd heard of rumours of submarines in the channel and had changed it to Christmas Eve.
The Leopoldville was met by its British escort, 4 destroyers under the charge of Commander John Pringle. Anti-submarine air patrols were not provided for the convoy. For the first time in his 6 months of channel duty, Pringle was ordered to sail a zigzag course, a measure used to confuse the German submarines, but adding hours to the voyage. Aboard the Leopoldville, no lifeboat, fire, or emergency drills were held during the crossing. The soldiers were not even instructed on how to put on their life jackets, even though Pringle's destroyers made 3 submarine sonar contacts within the first few hours and launched 1 depth charge attack. Outside Cherbourg Harbor waited Gerhard Meyer and U-486.
We did not know exactly where we were supposed to be debarking. And at approximately 6:30 that evening, we were about 5 miles from the coast of Cherbourg, and we were hit with a torpedo.
When the torpedo struck, we didn't really know what it was, whether it was a torpedo or a mine, but the ship seemed to just stop in the middle of the ocean, and many of the hammocks came tumbling down, so we all scrambled for a life vest and ran up to our stations on the deck of the ship.
There was another rumble, and the hull shook, and I was thrown out into the passageway, and the door closed behind me. And the door was, when it closed, was jammed. I never was able to get the door open, and I lost a friend there, who was stuck in the cabin.
On the destroyer Brilliant, Convoy Commander Pringle swung into action. Within minutes of the attack, he sent his first radio message to British Fleet Headquarters in England, giving a situation report and his position. Pringle's ship radio could not contact nearby Cherbourg because it could not tune to the frequencies used by the American-controlled port.
We had a lot of difficulty in communicating. Our ship's radio, from what I understand, was beamed to Liverpool, England. And it took quite some time before they could get a message over to Cherbourg that we needed assistance.
10 minutes later, Pringle sent another message to England. He was ordering all of his destroyers to hunt down the German submarine, standard British Navy escort operating procedure. The Leopoldville, with 2,235 men on board, was left alone, drifting into mines, its propeller shafts broken. Both his urgent messages to Fleet Headquarters in England were tragically mishandled and never relayed to Cherbourg by British Navy Headquarters. Despite the destroyer's barrage of depth charges, Gerhard Meyer and U-486 managed to slip away.
I don't have to tell you that I was scared as hell. I was very, very scared. And when we get up on top, and as cold as it was, and standing on that deck, and I looked up at that sky, and it was black, you know, with a couple stars up there, and boy, I started saying more Hail Marys than you ever heard of. And I told God if he'd ever get me off of that boat, that I'd become a priest. I wouldn't chase any more women. I wouldn't cuss. I wouldn't drink. And I'd become a monk, you know. But then I broke all them vows.
Amazingly enough, there was no commotion. Of course, we were all alerted and all anxious, but we sort of held our composure. Nobody got panicky. The officers more or less held their ground and kept us in line, and gradually got us above decks.
The American soldiers in the weld up below me behaved impeccably. They was all packed like sardines below me. They all just stood practically at attention.
30 minutes later, Pringle returned and signaled the Leopoldville, asking what she was transporting. He was shocked when Captain Limbaugh signaled back that he had troops on board. 4,000 he wrongly estimated. It was only then that the British commander discovered he was even escorting troops. He flashed an order to the Leopoldville. For the first time, 40 minutes after the torpedo hit, did Pringle try to contact Cherbourg for help, just 5 miles away.
And we were drifting into a minefield. So they had to drop the anchor to prevent us from going into the minefield. Now, once they dropped that anchor, they couldn't have towed us in with tugs. If they had got the tugs out, in other words, it's just my thinking, but it seems to me if they had brought the tugs out quick enough, they could have beached us, you know.
After seeing this message flashed from the bridge of the Leopoldville to the Brilliant, panic spread through Belgian Captain Limbaugh's crew, and, without orders to abandon ship, they ran for the lifeboats.
We were getting assurance that boats were coming from Cherbourg, 5.5, 6 miles away, to tow us in. We saw the crew come aboard deck, or come above deck with their bird cages, suitcases, and so on, lower the lifeboats and take off. They deserted the ship.
When we finally got on the top deck, none of the personnel from the Leopoldville were on that deck. They were in their lifeboats. They were gone. And what the hell can we do here? And some of those life rafts, they were still hanging there. But you couldn't get them down because you couldn't even move them. I don't know whether they was broken on those hangers or what. I don't know. We couldn't get them off. And all the life rafts, they're gone. They were gone.
You know, I think at the time, if we had had rifles and with ammunition, we would have shot them as they left the ship. But unfortunately, our rifles were down below, and we had no ammunition at that time either.
I don't know if I should say this or not, but Sergeant Hess was on one side of me and I was on the other side, and these two Belgian crews had the suitcases and ready to jump before a lot of the GIs. And Hesse looked at me and I looked at him, and we bumped them overboard because we wanted the GIs to have more room. So after what happened to them, I don't know, but they went down between the ships.
Knowing the Leopoldville was in danger, and with no rescue boats on the scene, Pringle decided to bring his destroyer alongside and take off some soldiers.
And then the HMS Brilliant came on the starboard side and threw lines and held steady to the Leopoldville. And then a lot of the fellows were starting to jump off the ship onto the destroyer. The only bad feature was the waves were real high. Sometimes there was 20, 30 feet difference in distance from the top of the ship to the bottom of the destroyer.
I'm noticing the red fluids on the ships. My God, that man was crushed to death. There's blood's all over the side of the ship. And that sort of shook me up. I don't know what the hell to do with that at that time.
And I decided it was my turn. So I got up on the rail and I did the same thing and I jumped. And I landed on the Brilliant. And I turned around and I couldn't believe my eyes. The next deck up, it was jammed with people that were still. I thought, I was naive, thought that we had pretty well cleared the ship just from the area that I was seeing. And they were mobbed along the next rail up, next deck up, and back there were more.
After 1 hour of taking off troops, the HMS Brilliant headed for port. Exactly how many men it got off will never be known. Reports range from 400 to 1,000. Pringle himself estimated 700. As the ship started to pull away, he received one last signal from the bridge of the Leopoldville. Imperative we abandon ship. Pringle later claimed at his board of inquiry that he never received this message, though it was written in his ship's log. Almost 2 hours had passed since the torpedo hit, and now night had fallen.
You still hear men screaming or yelling as they were trying to make the jump, or as they made the jump, and there were some men who were successful in making the jump. I don't know how many people the Brilliant took off this way, but then they left and left us alone.
There were men crawling all over that ship still. And by then there were men in the water because they were jumping without any thought of trying to get aboard the ship now, because the ship was pulling away. The Brilliant was pulling away. There were men all over the place.
The troop ship Leopoldville was now slowly sinking by the stern into the icy waters of the English Channel, its rear decks awash. As the HMS Brilliant entered Cherbourg Harbor, the American port authorities finally responded with a flashing signal to Pringle. It had taken the port over 2 hours to get rescue boats underway.
We called for help. They couldn't get us to help right away because some of the GIs or whoever that were on schedule for duty that night, they were out celebrating. And it took quite a while before some help come out there to get some of those people out of that water.
If they knew there was troops coming across, they should be on the alert. They know what was going to happen. Instead of having parties, they should have all the men, you know, on standby. So in case something happens, they could get out there fast. They didn't do it.
I think these people had just decided this is Christmas and I'm taking a night off from the war. And there was nobody to tell them, no, you can't take a night off, or you can't all take a night off. There was nobody, there was no really efficient officer left to sum up the situation, to see all the SOSs that were coming in, to know that his boat had been torpedoed, and to send out boats to find out.
The undermanned rescue boats and tugs, some with only a 2-man crew, finally reached the Leopoldville where the remaining 1,600 GIs were stranded without lifeboats. But it was too late. Men were already jumping off the ship into the waters.
I stayed on the ship until the steam started coming off the boilers, and I figured it was time to go. I found a rope, went down the side of the ship on a rope, floated into a mass of men that were in the water.
While I was in the water, I had a group of people come over, try to hold on to me, and they were fighting for their life. It was a little cold out there at that time of day. Don't remember how cold it was. I fought those people off, and then the last thing I remember doing was shoving a big plank in between my legs and then screaming for my mother.
I did think I was going to die. A few times. I was so cold, and my hands and that was going numb. And when I looked back, and at one time I could see 100 men behind me, and the next time I looked, there wasn't a soul.
In the meanwhile, this is probably 3.5 hours. I was in the water somewhere close to 30 minutes before I got picked up. Saw bodies floating by. By that time, men had frozen to death or drowned. We had been told 22 to 30 minutes was max survival time because of the temperature of the water. And like I say, it took 3 hours or better for rescue vessels to come that 5.5, 6 miles to get us.
At about 9 o'clock at night, after a final loud bang caused by the bulkheads breaking, the Leopoldville went to the bottom.
Now this was about approximately 4 hours after it was hit. It was pretty dark. You couldn't see the hand in front of you. It was a pitch black night. And the waves weren't that high, but still it was pretty good. And then we started to fish these people in, as many as we can get.
I was in the water for quite a period of time, it seemed, because I was drifting past I drifted past many of the rescue ships. There were so many men in the water at one time, and that was part of the problem. If they had brought the ships out, the rescue ships out, in an orderly fashion, and had gotten the men to go into the water in an orderly fashion, many more could have been rescued, but everybody was in the water almost at the same time.
We didn't save the bulk of them. We had maybe 50 men that we took in, but there were a lot of them that made it, you know, and French boats, Coast Guard boats. There were a lot of people in the channel that night picking up people.
I'd say we got about maybe 40, it's all. But you got to remember, they are very heavy. That's the heaviest thing on earth to do, is try to, because they're soaked with that heavy coat on, and plus these people had rifles and their in fact I'd say half of them had their all their personal stuff with them.
The rescue boats worked all night, but a man could not live long in the icy winter waters. 1 hour after the Leopoldville went down, hardly anyone in the water was still alive.
The next morning they brought in what bodies they could pick up from the water, and they just stacked them up on the shoreline there, just like logs. It just tore your heart out to see your buddies laying there dead, frozen stiff, dead.
And that's all they kept telling us, is to lay them out like cordwood, right along, because the dock was long. And they laid, it's even hard to guess how many we laid out there.
Oh, there was, I couldn't count it. There was plenty of what the French had picked up, what other boats had picked up, what our own government had picked up. The bodies were just up there for you to take a look and try to identify them.
Bodies were washing up on shore for the next couple of weeks. I didn't see anybody I knew, and I kind of lost heart. I didn't want to really find anybody I knew.
Somebody told me these Army Air Corps lowboys, trailers, were brought in, and they loaded the bodies on there and took them to the general hospital first, where they tagged them, done whatever they were supposed to do, and then they took them to St. Marigle's Cemetery. So about a week later, I went to St. Marigle's Cemetery, because that's not too far either from where I was. And sure enough, they were all buried there. And I tried to find out exactly how many there were. But nobody would say nothing. Nobody would say how many there were. Nobody would even say who it was. You know, it was just soldiers, period.
Many of the over 1,000 secret documents on the Leopoldville were declassified in 1996. Only the high-ranking admirals and generals of Allied command, whose names appear on these pages, will ever know why they were sealed for 50 years. But where the cover-up started and how it was maintained is now clear. In January 1945, 2 weeks after the sinking, the British Admiralty sent a message to General Eisenhower, insisting that in order to keep the morale of the U-boat fleet low, the Leopold disaster be kept in strict silence. Eisenhower agreed with the British and sent a message to Washington ordering any public statement made about the disaster be cleared through himself and Admiralty. The generals in Washington disagreed. They wrote back that consistent War Department policy was to release the facts of a ship sinking whenever the loss of American military personnel was large. But Eisenhower and Admiralty got their way. The next of kin would not be informed, nor any statements released about the disaster. In a startling reversal of policy, the War Department caved in and agreed to release no information about the sinking. Notification telegrams were finally sent out to the next of kin 3 weeks later, stating only that the men were missing in action in the European area.
We were told explicitly not to say a word about the mess that we were in and the neglect and the lack of communications. But then again, it was war, and those things do happen.
Myself and other officers in the company got letters from families that wanted to know how. And we weren't able to tell them. We were under strict orders that the subject was not to be discussed. So we wrote as best we could and said, your son or your husband died doing his duty. But we were not free to give them any information as to what had happened.
I tried to write letters here, and no more I'd write something in a letter, they'd go to work and censor it. They would throw it away. And then the lieutenant would come up to you and say, hey, are you sick? Do you feel right? I said, what do you mean? You're not supposed to write home about this in your letters. I just want to let them know what happened to us. You're not allowed to tell them what happened to us that night. This was it. They would not let us tell it.
The U.S. Office of Inspector General conducted an investigation into the Leopoldville. It lasted just 5 days, and the mere 2-page report found both British authorities at Southampton and the Belgian crew negligent, but not one American on the Cherbourg rescue operation.
Admiral Stark oversaw the investigation and okayed it, and it was a sloppy investigation. Eisenhower okayed the secretiveness, not letting it out. There are letters signed by him, although I wasn't allowed to see them then at the time, nor at that time was I allowed to see the Stark thing. But I was allowed to see enough of the investigations to know how badly they were done.
In contrast to the Americans, the British Admiralty conducted a thorough, secret inquiry into the disaster. After 2 weeks of hearings, the board found the Belgian crew and Captain Limbourg negligent. Commander John Pringle, captain of the Brilliant, was found partly responsible for the loss of 300 additional lives. For this and other errors in judgment, they disciplined him and transferred him to another ship. However, 1 month later, Pringle and his crew received a secret commendation for his gallant action from an unexpected source, an American general.
The Americans in Cherbourg were negligent. The British convoy commander was negligent. The Belgians were not only negligent, they were really foul.
Later, in another strange twist, the Admiralty denied the findings of their own investigation and completely exonerated the Belgians.
The Board of Inquiry was of the opinion that the master, ship's officers and crew carried out their duties in accordance with the highest traditions of the Belgian Marine.
I think the real purpose of the silence was maybe not to hide the event, but not to embarrass our allies, perhaps, to avoid really facing this. It was, you just called it an act of war, and there it goes, and that explains away a lot of things.
cover-up continued after the war, but the press heard rumors of the disaster from survivors' accounts.
Before we reached the shore, United States, we were told that the newspaper people would be at the docks and they would be asking questions. We could admit, yes, we were on the Leopoldville, or we were in the 66th Infantry Division. But other than to give any description of what happened or details, we were not to do so. After all, I was an officer and I have to follow the wishes of my superiors, which I did.
In 1946, the New York Times and Reuters began investigations into the Leopoldville sinking, based on survivors' accounts circulating in America. From the Reuters London office, the British journalist Ronald Bedford wrote the Admiralty for information.
I went down to investigate the background to the sinking of the Belgian liner Leopoldville. At first, the Admiralty were giving me some information, but later on, some weeks after, I was called down again and told that, well, they were sorry, but there was no more that they could tell me. And this was indeed followed up by a letter to me from Admiralty confirming that there was no more help that they could give.
The British Admiralty's policy on the status of the Leopoldville was decided by Richard Royal Powell, head of Military Branch 2, in a memo dated 19th March 1946, almost 1 year after the end of the war in Europe. They would remain classified for the next 50 years.
The story of the Leopoldville does not reflect any great credit upon us, and I should be averse from disclosing it until the need is very strong. To issue anything publicly now in America might only serve to revive a controversy which would be better allowed to die.
The events that took place that Christmas Eve, 1944, have been engraved into the memories of the men who survived the watery death of the Leopoldville. They have lived with their secret nightmare now for more than half a century.
Hit the lights.
Here we need the front lights.
Back memories. The only regret that I have that I didn't know about this until afterwards. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear this? Is that I had great respect for Eisenhower. Never met him, but when I knew about this, I voted for him. But I wouldn't have if I knew what was going on here. It was all politics. Whole politics. He got to be President of the United States. George Patton, who was a soldier's general, was murdered on the Autobahn in Germany. Of course, they didn't like him. I mean, it was never publicized. But anyway, I was midship when this thing happened. And I remember one of the, not the brilliant, but an ocean-going British tug came out. And I was on the deck. I looked behind. There was a galley. And I figured, well, I could see the stern going down. And I was midships. And I figured, well, with the wash, I might get thrown back into the galley. I figured I'd climb down. There was a rope ladder. And I remember a British sailor telling me, jump, jump. I said to myself, this guy's got to be out of his mind. He's about 20 to 30 feet below and sinking, bobbing up. And there's an old saying, the good Lord only takes the good. He made up my mind for me. I was washed off. I went into the ocean. I wasn't ready for him. But anyway, the saga begins. After I left the hospital in Cherbourg, as I say, I was transferred to the 42nd Rainbow Division in Austria. And as we were going toward Vienna, going toward Czechoslovakia, scouting report came back that there was a, I don't know if he's got a picture of this. Well, there's my outfit in the field. You can see they lined up with the mess kits. Hey, Ray. As I said, I look like Brandon there 40, 50 years ago. That's me here. But anyway, this is a shot that was taken in France. I think this was our platoon leader, Long. I remember him. I don't know where I am here. I might have gone to the head at the time the picture was taken. I don't know. Anybody who's been a GI knows you have to have a dog. This was in Austria with a couple of puppies. And I don't know where they came from, but I guess the people abandoned them and Americans took a liking to animals. I still like dogs. This might be reminiscent, 40 and 8s, 40 men, 8 horses. During World War I. But I think what the French meant to say was they put the 40 men and the 8 horses all in the same car. Because this, I don't know where we were going. But these are some of the fellows that were moving on. Most of us was moved by truck transport, but moving up to the front. That's me on the end. This shows that when the war was over in Europe, May the 7th, we were sent to Arles, France, where some of you are involved in art, where Vincent van Gogh, the famous painter, cut his ear off. It's about, oh, not too far from Marseille. And they had these transportation corps. At that time, everything was segregated. Blacks were the transportation and quartermaster, etc. And we were processing them to go through the Suez Canal, then we were to follow, go to Japan. And of course, luckily they dropped the A-bomb and the war was over with August the 14th. Then that's when I was transferred to the Rainbow Division. Incidentally, that has a great history to it. The Rainbow Division was Custer's 7th Cavalry during the Indian Wars. And many of you that are, I guess, my age would know, seen the movie The Fighting 69th with James Cagney and Pat O'Brien. That was the 69th Division, the First World War, New York outfit. That's the 42nd. In fact, Brandon, I think, you're part of that now, aren't you? They're up in Watertown? Right. Anyway, this is a, you can tell my age, even my glasses, my eyes are shut. This is a map of Austria, and as I say, after I went into the 42nd, we started to move toward Czechoslovakia, and on May the 5th, scouting report came back. You got a photo of that too, don't you, Brandon? Yeah, there we go. There was a concentration camp up around in somewhere, Austria, down in here, called Ebensee. Most people never heard of it. Heard of Dachau, Mulhausen, and some of the others, but this is a picture of it there. It was in the part of the Carpathian Mountains, and they had something like 10,000 Czechoslovakian Jews, mostly men. The Germans, that's the way we found them. Most of them worked in a munitions plant. And we're getting our rules ahead of ourselves with the slide. But anyway, after that, I joined the Army of Occupation, and I was sent down to, strange as it seems, about 58 kilometers outside of Salzburg, a little town called Concordia Hut. We had 13,000 SS. For those of you who don't know, the SS were the stormtroopers. And after the Second World War, many of them took off their uniforms and went into civilian clothes. And it was surprising. None of them were Nazis. They're all Polish. That's what they told you anyway. But the way you determine who was an SS, they had the blood type tattooed under the left armpit. And what we would do is we'd tell them to, you know, they had to have their passports. That's what I learned in Germany. Haben Sie Papier? And they go, no, nix Nazi, you know, Polski. Everyone was a Pole. So we told them to take the shirt off, and we saw the blood type. We knew they were SS. But anyway, when I went down to Austria, it was a camp of 13,000 SS, and what they did was a lumber camp. We sent them up into the mountains, and they built these flumes, and they would take these flumes down to a mill and chop up the wood for displaced persons. There was a lot of displaced persons, Czechoslovakians, Russians, Yugoslavians, who didn't want to go back either to Russia because they were collaborators with the Germans and for other political reasons. And anyway, when we approached this thing, you can see there was an iron gate here. We didn't know what it was. And when we got back there, we just saw this. It was unbelievable. There was something like, as they say, 10,000 men. And they were nothing but skin and bones. Of course, the Germans had taken off toward Czechoslovakia. And, of course, May the 7th, the war was declared over. That's when I, as I say, I'm getting ahead of myself, went to this prisoner of war camp, and I was discharged. I came back to the United States on June the 8th, 1946. Now, the saga continues. 50-some-odd years later, I'm living in Voorhees, New Jersey, and I joined a gymnasium. And, you know, you see people, men in a locker room, you don't pay too much attention. The fellow right there was coming out of the shower, and he had a tattoo mark on his wrist, which the Germans put on for concentration camp victims, besides the Star of David. And one of the fellows said to him, "Were you," I didn't pay much attention, I was drying off. They said, "Were you in a concentration camp?" And he said, "Yeah, I was in Servalov." He spoke with an accent. And he says, "One of them was Evansy." Well, Evansy rang a bell. That was the camp that we had freed. So I went up to him. Anyway, that's at the Aquatic Fitness Center. And there, the Courier Post. My, how I've changed. To look like Brandon again. I'd give anything, I guess. But anyway, he was one of the prisoners, one of the 10,000. I don't know who he was at the time. It was 10,000 of them. And what they would do is they send out 5,000 at a time to work in the munitions plant. The other 5 they keep in the barracks. But anyway, he was one of the fortunate ones. I have this shot of when he was, oh yeah. And like Brandon. My wife saw that. She said, "What happened to you?" I said, "Good Ukrainian cooking." This is him, and his name was Sidney Newman, Czechoslovakian Jew. Out of where the camp was in Evansy. That's me with the driver in the field. Here he is as a baby. I remember with an accent, he says his mother, his father. I think he was the only survivor. The rest of them were all killed by the Germans. But as chance would have it, they say 50 years later, it was uncanny to run into somebody that was in a concentration camp that I was the outfit that had liberated. But anyway, the fellow that owned the gym was so enamored over the fact he gave me a lifetime membership to the gym. I told him I hope I lived to be 125. So this is it, married with 3 children. I survived some life diseases, but I'm here to talk about it. Yes?
How about your career after the war as well?
Pardon me?
Your career after the war. Your career after the war.
Oh, after the war? Oh, I went to college under the GI Bill. And strange as it seems, I took up pre-med. They had quotas. I couldn't get into med school. So I went back and took extra credits. I went into journalism, attended Temple University here in Philadelphia. Got my first job with the Philadelphia Bulletin. I was happy to get it, $55 a week. This is back in I married in 50, I graduated in 1951. And I was one of the lucky ones. I worked for the New York Times for 30 years. After that, I was in New York for 17, and then I got transferred to Philadelphia. That's the reason why I'm here. Any questions? Oh, just wanted to show you something. This is the SS war camp. This is a German water canteen. And one of the prisoners for in fact, they gave out K-rations. I don't know if you know what they were. You got 4 cigarettes, some hardtack that you had to have an axe to chop it. Even up in France, the Norwegian rats wouldn't even eat the hardtack. Then they had little cans of cheese, would stop you from going to the John for like 3 weeks after you ate one of those. But for 3 cigarettes, he made this canteen. It was carved out of a mess kit knife with vegetable dyes. And it was something that showed the countries we were with, and this is the seal of Salzburg. It's my name, 242nd Infantry, Rainbow Division, and this was the 66. And I got $10 a month extra for this. A lot of pay. It was good money at the time. Yeah, this is a replica of a German Luger, but I had somehow well, I hope I'm not investigated for it, but when I came back to the States, I smuggled in my bag. I had a P-38, I had a Mauser that the German officers used to carry, and a Luger. I don't know what happened to it. My parents died, but I happened to find this. This was a dagger that the Wehrmacht, which is the regular soldiers, carried. Not a bayonet, but they carried it in their belt back in here. And strange as it seems, they're supposed to be atheists. And on their buckles they had God mit uns. God was with them. And I remember God coming down and saying, hey, I'm on your, like even today, I'm on your side, I'm on that side. But this was something that my son, who's standing there taking pictures, talked me into. I had the War Department. He said, why don't you get some of the decorations that you had earned? So long ago, forget about it. And I never said anything about the concentration camp, even to my wife, until after this thing happened. But anyway, I wrote to the War Department. They said all the records were destroyed in the fire in St. Louis in 1974. I never existed. Maybe some of you never did either. Luckily, I found an original copy of my Army discharge, which I sent to them. And they sent me, of course, I had the patch. This is one of my dog tags.
Can you hold it up, Russ?
No, I don't know if you know it. The Germans had their dog tags, they were round. But the reason for this, with this little indentation, when you got it, they stick it in your mouth, and the other one would go to grave registration. And that's how they identify you. And, of course, I got the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, the Good Conduct Medal, I don't know why. Army of Occupation. I don't know what the other one for. Oh, it was World War II medal. And, of course, this represented $10 a month extra, the ruptured duct when you got honorably discharged. And I, pardon me?
That's not his.
Oh, that's not mine.
That's mine.
Brendan picked that up. I wouldn't be able to get into it anyway, wherever it is. But I don't know what this meant. I got this as a rifle. When I was a youngster, my mother never allowed me to have a cat pistol in the house.
Looks like a German Iron Cross.
Yeah, I got one of those, but it isn't. I don't know, it's marksman, something they give out that. But then the Army of Occupation medal, which I had stayed over. One here. This is $1.50. It gets you right on a bus.
Does anyone have questions for Mr. LaRosa?
Do you recollect when you were thrown off the ship, or what happened?
Well, everything was befuddled. It was true that what was said there. Nobody gave orders, and some of the officers. Now we had a colonel. His name was Romberg, and they found him the next day. He lost his wrist. He tried to swim. He's a big guy. He tried to swim the 5 miles on the shore. They found him. Of course, he bled to death. But I remember coming up when I heard the thud. I remember they had the hammocks. And Christmas Eve, you feel kind of despondent, of course. And I remember getting some hardtack and plum jam. Now, these were vivid in my mind. And I was like an all-day sucker. Of course, that hardtack, you had to soften it up, and I have teeth. And I remember a loud thud. Nobody said what had happened. I saw the dust flying up, and everybody had their weapons who carried it. I had a BAR, Browning automatic rifle, was above the racks. And finally, nobody says, hey, get up above deck. I was above the water line. I was one of the fortunate ones to say, God only takes the good. And I got up on deck, and I wandered around. I could hear them screaming down below. And as the ships came up, they took some of them, tried to get some of them off with stretchers. But the water was so rough, they were falling in between. So I was about midship at the time, and I could see the thing was starting to list. In fact, the picture they showed there was just the opposite. Of course, they showed the prow of the ship facing this way, but it was this way. And the back started to go down, and I was on this side. As I climbed down, I looked back, and I see this galley with these huge cauldrons. And I said, oh, my God, if I get washed into this, there's another fellow. Anyway, some water came up, a wave, and must have thrown me away. And all I did was I hung on to some debris that they had, and I got hit with something, and a British tug. And surprising as it seems, the last thing I heard was in a Cockney accent, a British sailor singing Down the Mississippi. I don't know if you remember that song. Anyway, that's when I was taken unconscious. I was taken to the hospital, and of course I could have fought for Section 8, but 19 years old, you know, you do what you had to do, and that was it.
Does anyone have another question for Mr. LaRosa?
Well,
why don't you tell him about this book?
Oh yeah, this guy Jack Sanders. I didn't meet him until I worked for the New York Times. He was on the sister ship. He was not on the Leopoldville, and I have it also in a hardback. This is a softback. He put this book out, tells about the night before Christmas, what had happened, and
Russ is in chapter 13 in that book.
Chapter 13?
Yeah.
Because it shows just much attention I paid to this, right? 9.
That book was published in 1961.
Let's see.
And
oh, yeah. A few hours before, Russell LaRosa, that's me, I forgot my middle initial, but I don't mind, had been a sleepy casual, PFC, with a box of Christmas candy in his gas mask. Tell you something about the Christmas candy. My parents told me they sent me packages. Now, I don't know, we used to call, I hope there's nobody there of French descent, but we used to call the French frogs. I think they used to steal everything out of the postal. I never got any of it. So before we shipped out on the Cherbourg, I got a package, and in it, I opened it up, was a box of chocolate-covered cherries, 2 pairs of woolen socks, and a crusty old bread that had turned green. One of those Italian hoagies, New York to go here. I said to myself, what the hell? I mean, I know things are rough, but not this bad. I was going to throw it out, and I went, I hear gurgling. My father was pretty astute. Took a bottle of brandy. Went to the bakery, took out this loaf of bread, scooped the inside out, and put the brandy in. Well, if the Germans had decided to gas us, I wouldn't be here. Because I took out all the insides. I threw the bread away, but I kept the bottle of brandy, the 2 pair of socks, and the chocolate-covered cherries. That's what I had in my gas mask. He was gathering himself to leap to a rescue boat when a British officer waved and shouted encouragement, but LaRosa had seen men crushed between the Brilliant and the Leopoldville. Now suddenly he saw a man crushed between the craft and the troop ship. That's when I said to myself, I'm not that crazy. I'm not going to jump. If I go down, I'm going to go down with it. And he froze. They said, there's no way there's some foxholes. I said, I need that time to pray. I couldn't jump, and in the midst of all this, down in his ears, yet positive of what they told him, Rosa heard the voice of the sailor from the rescue boat singing, won't you come along with me down the Mississippi, in a Cockney accent. And the rest is all shown on his history.
And any other questions for Mr. LaRosa?
Well, as I said, I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy that you took the time. Thank you. Thank you.